Okay, I think we have a decent number of people. We can start now.
Okay, yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome, Ankit. We're super excited to have you on. So, I'm sure everyone already knows Ankit since he has been mentoring and helping out through Xoogler School. But if you don't, he has worked at a bunch of different places. He worked at Google as a software engineer for a couple years, and he's also working as a startup like investor and advisor, as well as a partner with Xoogler.co. So that's a small snippet. He's done a lot of things, and it's really impressive. But that's like a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and kick it off with just one question that I had, which was, why did you go from like why did you choose to go from Google software engineering to investing?
Interesting. Well, firstly, I am not a full-time investor. I'm still a software engineer. So it's a little bit different way to answer this question, but I think it might be helpful for people to know my background because I don't know how many people actually have looked at my background. And then it'll become more relevant that people can ask specific questions. So, okay, I'm very old, so I'm gonna not kind of like go all the way too far back. But okay, I graduated in 2008. But I grew up in New Delhi, India, and I graduated from Delhi University, which is actually not an IIT. Most people in US only know of IIT from India, but like Delhi University is still sort of like top 20, 25, arguably, universities in India. I graduated in 2008. In fact, like how I chose computer science was also very interesting. I actually gave my engineering exam and I wasn't really very sure what to do, like which field to choose. In fact, like back in the days, computers wasn't used to be the top priority. People would choose electronics over it. And I just, for some reason, I was like really enjoyed doing computers back in my high school, and I decided to choose computer engineering. We used to call computer engineering, we call computer science here. It's the same thing. Um, and like in the first year, like I was kind of like in a way looked down at. It's like I could have chosen electronics to do in my university, and like I somehow decided to not take that and take computers. And people were like, "Why would you do that?" And I was like, I don't know, I just like enjoy writing code rather than building electronics. And like, no offense with that, like I think building electronics is also cool, but like for some reason I just had more exposure to doing computer science. Anyways, so that happened, and I graduated in 2008, and even before that, I actually, when I was in my final year, I was like so bored that I actually found some freelance work to do, and which is like very rare to do back, at least like back in those days. And also, like I'm always talking like back in those days, it's like like almost 2 decades ago. It's 2008, um, but like I think internships wasn't very popular in India, and it was like I had an option to do an internship, but it was unpaid. So instead I like decided to go like do some freelance work, and I actually ended up making a lot of money and a lot of good network, and through that I learned a lot. And I think that's something which I still kind of like. Some of the things, I actually built a lot of games during that time, so like I think somewhat similar to Pun. I don't know whether Pun is here on the call. But after that, I ended up joining Cisco, which was my first job out of school. And the way actually jobs work in India is a little bit different, where there is like campus recruiting, but at the same time, like the interviews and everything still happens within the like companies come to your college and they actually do interviews there itself. So Cisco was the first company that came to college, and I just applied. I was like everyone was applying, and I got through, and that's how I ended up at Cisco. I learned quite a lot, made a lot of great friends. After a year and a half, I got bored, so I interviewed at a bunch of places. I interviewed at Adobe, Microsoft, Amazon. I ended up having actually offers from all three. Um, uh, and the way I decided to use Adobe or join Adobe was because they were actually working on something really cool. Like before, so that's where kind of like my freelance work comes in. I actually worked in, I worked in, like I did a lot of like games, but the games I did were for mobile. And the team that I worked in Adobe was actually building Flash Player for mobile phones. And this is kind of like this crazy era when like Steve Jobs was like, no, Flash Player like stinks. Like we don't want Flash Player on mobile devices. And this is like kind of like we had like this white hack like white hat hacker group in Adobe who was like building Flash Player, and like we had like apps which were using Flash Player compiled and like deployed on App Store, and Apple did not know about it. Eventually, they came to know about it. They shut it down. Our project got scrapped, and I think it was a bit serendipitous. At that point, I got Google reached out to me, and this was like I was working in Adobe in India, and Google reached out to me, decided like offering me in a position in US, and I was like, wow, this is a great opportunity. In fact, like actually, they gave me a role which I was less excited about, but I still pursued it. I got an offer, and I was after getting an offer, I was actually able to negotiate with them to give me a better role than what they were offering me. And like it was kind of like a lot of back and forth, and happy to kind of like go into that too. But eventually I got that offer and moved to US, and this was 2011, so this was not a decade ago. And since then it's been an interesting journey. I like Google was always my dream job to work at. Like I really enjoyed like working with everyone, made a lot of friends, learned a lot. And being in Silicon Valley, I also got the startup bug. So with that, I was in Google for about 3.5 years. And after that, I left that to join a company called Homejoy. And I was like, if I were to do a startup, I actually first need to learn how a startup works. And I think that's also very important, because like many times when you're thinking about doing a startup, you also like joining early stage startups gives you a lot of perspective and understanding of how companies work. And that's what I did. I worked there for a year, learned so much more than what I did at Homejoy and at Google. In fact, like there are different kind of learning, right? Like Google makes you a really good engineer, like a software engineer makes you have really good coding skills. But working at startup actually like teaches you almost everything else. It teaches you how to acquire customers, how to think about business models, how to think about revenues, and everything else that you typically don't learn when you're like working as a software engineer in a big company. I was there for a year. The company eventually got bought back by Google, and I was like, this is too early for me to go back to Google. I was only out for a year, and I actually decided to decline that offer and join a fund as an EIR. That's where kind of like some of my experience around like understanding how funds work, understanding how startups investment work, those kind of things come in. I was in EIR with them, kind of like exploring different ideas and also kind of like helping them a little bit. That's when I also met Chris, and started helping out on the Xoogler community, because I was also doing some startups, and like Chris was trying his startup, and we were like, okay, let's kind of like see how we can help the startup ecosystem. My startup did not go anywhere, but as you know, like we are all here, so I got like a lot more involved in Xoogler community. Alongside, obviously, I still had the software engineer in me, so I ended up joining a company called Shippo. That is a shipping API company. It's a B2B compared to what Homejoy was, which was B2C. And I was there for 2.5 years. Joined the company when they were like very early, didn't have enough funding, and like we raised 2 rounds of funding when I was there, and then we grew the team from 12 people to 70 people when I left. And more recently, in 2018, I left that, joined a company called Lumi Labs. And that's a startup founded by Marissa Meyer. Some of you may know of her as one of the early engineers, well, the first female engineer at Google, and also the CEO of Yahoo. I joined as a founding engineer. In fact, actually, I met Marissa through one of the Xoogler events that we hosted. Chris actually moderated that event, and we talked after the event, and kind of like they were looking for their first hire, and I was looking for like different ideas to go pursue myself. Instead, I ended up joining them, and I'm still with them. I'm really enjoying. We started the team when I joined. We were like 1-person team, well, 3 people including founders, and now we are about 15. So I kind of wanted to give some perspective on my background, so that kind of like people have something specific that they would want to ask, that they can ask. Alongside, anyways, working on Lumi Labs, I helped run some of those initiatives of Xooglers, and globally kind of like helping run, coordinate with volunteers, kind of like running events. I really enjoy helping founders. So like host a lot of like founder related events. These days, we are actually helping a lot of YC founders who have applied to Y Combinator. And you already heard from Kat, that was on Friday, right? So you already heard from Kat, and yeah, like kind of like that is also one of the ways through which we help help Xooglers get into Y Combinator, but we also help them get like application review, prepare them for interviews, and that's something we are kind of like coordinating as well. Alongside, I do some investments, and most of the investments actually come through some of the investments we do on Xoogler side. And I'm also investing through some of the other investors. Most of these investments happen on a platform called AngelList. AngelList is a platform through which some of the investors share some of the deals, and that helps us like understand the deals and invest. Typically, most of the time, like the way I invest, the amount is actually very little. It's more about like understanding the businesses, kind of like getting more excited about like the future and like overall understanding the markets. So that's where kind of like my interest in overall startups and investment comes in. Now I've spoken for a very long time. I'm gonna pause here and let Jennifer take over and ask questions.
Yeah, definitely. So if anybody didn't see the story, I'm going to post it back in the chat again. So anybody that recent joined us can have access to that. But no, that's all very interesting, Ankit. I love that you've had a variety of experiences, because not a lot, like lots of people have a lot of experiences, but yours is so unique. I find that really interesting. So I think I'm really curious personally about what you feel like, if you enjoyed working at the bigger company like Google or working at the startups, like the differences in that and the pros and cons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of like one question which gets asked a lot.
Yeah.
And honestly, like I would recommend almost everyone to actually get experience from both places. Just because, as I said earlier, companies provide different learning capabilities, right? Like for instance, at Google, like it's funny because actually even before Google, I had worked in companies and like Cisco and Adobe for a total of like 2.5 years. And I still remember when I joined Google, my first code review, which was about like 1,000 lines of code, it took me 2 weeks to actually get that reviewed, which was essentially like there was a huge difference between the coding styles that I had learned at other companies versus what Google expected. So in a way, like this is an experience I would have not received anywhere else. Like honestly, the code reviews that typically happen in startups are very minimal, like if any. So I think that like certainly Google made me a lot better engineer. Like I learned so much about like systems. Learned so much about like writing good code. I learned so much about how kind of like things are like put together and kind of like become built big systems. At the same time, working at startups kind of like taught me almost everything other than like coding, right? It taught me about like how you think about like growing the business, how you think about um, product management, how you think about finance, how you think about advertising, all of those things. So that's why I always recommend people to at least get experience from both. And especially like from large companies, it's better to get experience early because like kind of like that's when you are actually like learning a lot about coding. Once you go a little bit later in your career, at that point it becomes a lot more about like showing impact and kind of like understanding like business and understanding like things going around you. And at that point, I think startups are a lot more interesting. So that's why I've like kind of like transitioned into working in startups, and I've really enjoyed that. Maybe I'll go back to Google someday, but like I think I'm still really enjoying the startup days.
Yeah, that's really cool. I
Jennifer,
know.
I'm so sorry to cut you off for 1 second, but Ankit, can you give me hosting rights again so I can put this back onto YouTube? Thank you.
Wait, oh, you lost hosting rights. Hold on. Okay. Is that enough, or should I make you a host?
I think I have to become the host.
Okay.
Thank you.
There you go.
So I'm going to go ahead and jump to Iris's question so her question is, how would you compare working at a VC versus being a seed investor yourself? What's your opinion on being a product manager at a VC fund?
Wait, say that one more time. Product manager at a VC fund?
Yeah, that's what she said.
Interesting. So it's an interesting question. Like typically there aren't really product managers at VC fund itself. Typically it's like either you work at a startup as a product manager, or most of the roles at VC are typically investment related. There are bigger funds, like for instance, there is funds like Andreessen Horowitz, who has like what 70, 80 partners, in which cases they have a lot of operating partners. Most of them are like related to helping you acquire talent, helping you with some go-to-market strategies, helping you with sales. I think product management isn't really a role that typically applies to venture capital. Now, I can kind of like talk about like possibly engineering versus product management, but I think like Iris, if you want to like clarify the question, is there something, did I answer your question?
Yeah, so I think that's the second question I was asking. So the reason I asked that is because I just did an interview today as a product manager at the VC fund. It's a fund called Georgian, and they're based in Toronto. And the reason they have a PM role is because they have their internal platform, which is data to like source deals for themselves, and also build AI platforms for the portfolio companies. So I was wondering if you have any insights on that.
Interesting. No, I think that's a good point, because there are actually some funds. I actually also saw Initialize Capital is one of the other funds that has PMs, and in fact, like I think even Signal Fire has product managers. And typically, it's I would say it's very similar to product managers in a startup, because typically you will be working on building products, right? It's not there isn't really like anything which is very specific to a venture capital itself, except for the fact, obviously, startups typically comes with like advantage where they will give you equity that may actually become something very meaningful in future. I think in case of venture cap, in a VC firm, it will probably be mostly dependent on like your compensation will primarily be cash, in which case it's like a very defined compensation you get. And I think it'll be similar to like working as a product manager in a big company, except in a VC, it's kind of like typically there would be a very small team. So you will more likely be working fairly independently and like building products by yourself, as in like leading by yourself. So in a way, like they're hiring product managers to build internal tools. And that's where kind of like they don't want to kind of do that by themselves. They would probably like hire some engineers as well and help them build the tools like along with the product manager.
Okay, got it. Yeah, and my first question was, how do you compare working at a VC fund versus being a seed investor yourself?
I mean, I think there are like pros and cons. Like, again, I think the way you're saying seed investor, probably you're implying angel investor, because like typically there is angel investments, which is individuals putting in their own money. And then there are working at VC funds, which could be seed or later stage, in which case a VC fund is defined by having LPs, limited partners. And these limited partners are the people who have put in their own money and given it to a fund. And this fund has a fund manager who's investing. Okay, so there is angel investor, and then there is a fund manager. So I will say in terms of angel investor, you're investing your own money. And in terms of a fund manager, you're investing somebody else's money, right? So the main difference there is I actually really, I mean, obviously I don't have a lot of experience from a venture fund manager standpoint, but like I've really enjoyed doing angel investments. And I think there's a little bit of difference here. So one thing is when you're investing as a fund manager, you are actually like investing, like you're using a lot of analysis and kind of like trying to figure out like whether the investments you're making are going to bring back the return, as in like you're going to make money for your investors. Versus when you're angel investing, typically you invest because you really believe in an idea and you want to support them. So it's more like you're making a personal decision. And the difference is because in angel investing, I'm investing my own money, versus in case of a fund manager, you're investing somebody else's money. So now you have a responsibility to return that money to the investor back. Does that make sense? So that's why like typically angel investors are much more likely to invest early, because they would want to really like back ambitious founders, versus fund managers typically invest a little bit later when they actually can see some business models, understand the revenues, understand the business better, and make a more informed decision.
Okay, got it.
This is like very high level. Again, there's like a lot of like ifs and buts, and like there's even pre-seed funds, kind of like A4 is actually one of them, and like who will invest like super early. But I think there's at least like a some sort of like, I would say, a fiduciary duty of fund managers to be able to return the money back to the investors, versus angel investment is more about like, do you actually like feel passionate about investing in a particular company?
Sounds good. Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question here on the Dory that we have from another student. And the student is asking, do you have any habits for keeping knowledgeable and sharp about rapid pace of change in tech, assuming this must be an even more important skill when investing, advising early stage startups?
Yes, absolutely. There are many things that you can do. One is obviously there is like you can actually read threads and forums. Like I actually follow like some of the like more common forum you may have heard of is called Hacker News. Is actually the one which is managed by Y Combinator themselves. That's a place where people post like new kind of things that are coming up. The other thing I do is I actually follow some of the interesting people on Twitter who could be kind of like doing some research work. And the third is like typically like just like talk to smart people around you, right? Like talk to your colleagues, like especially when you're a software engineer, you definitely have a lot of like other engineers around you. So just kind of like talking to them, learning from what they've learned, like, or like figuring out like what kind of things that they're like working on their side or those kind of things definitely help. Other than that, I think like generally I'm a big fan of not kind of like going and like taking a lot of classes, but also learning on the job. So I always take the opportunity to kind of like try and learn something new. In fact, like as you can see, my career, in fact, like all the work I've done as software engineer, there isn't really a pattern. In fact, there's an anti-pattern in the sense that I have done. I started as I was telling earlier. I started my career doing game development, and then I moved into doing some web development, and then I moved into doing some systems work at Cisco. I moved, and then I like built some mobile apps, and then I did some backend infrastructure. So I've done a lot of like back and forth, and the reason is every time I actually tried something different, I learned a lot, and I think that's one way to kind of like stay on top of the new stuff coming up. And like also like I always prefer to be, you know, like jack of all trades as opposed to master of one. But again, like I think there are some advantages and disadvantages to that thing as well. So like it depends, but I think like having understanding of like many different pieces really make me enjoy and appreciate technology.
Yeah, I feel like that's really insightful for a lot of people because talking seems to be that's important, but not a lot of people seem to actually enforce it. So it's great to hear. So kind of moving away from more of the tech and skills. So Elena is wondering, as a non-American application at Google, what was your H-1B process like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say I was very lucky in all of this. So the story that I actually don't tell a lot, and it's funny because it's going to be put on YouTube, but I interviewed first time at Google in 2008 and I got rejected. This was like I had 5 interviews. I got rejected after 5 interviews, and I didn't hear back from them for 2 years. And back in later in 2010, they reached out to me themselves. And I think one of the reasons was the economy was still kind of like coming back from the slowdown in 2008. And in fact, like visa was actually very open. So I never like had to like worry about like getting through a lottery. I just applied, the visa applications were open. I just like got my visa approved within a month. So they did apply and get through the visa. That said, I think there are like many different ways through which people like around me have come to US. There are 2 more common ways. One is you typically work in the local office of Google or like any other company for a year or 2. Typically, Google hasn't invested a lot in Indian offices, and most of the Indian offices in Google has been sort of like training grounds where they have like engineers work there for a couple of years and then they bring them to US. And that's actually visa process is much simpler for that one. And the other one is many students do is actually they take up their graduate degrees and they take the graduate degrees in US. That's another way that through which many of the students actually come to US. So I would say like it's about almost half and half how my friends have taken their route. It's less likely that they kind of like get into like the situation I had was a little bit more unique just because of timing. although how the economics is changing now, it's possible like it may happen again.
Yeah, I feel like that's interesting. So kind of off of that, the second part of her question was, what can international students at American universities do to maximize their chances of getting a work visa?
They can do to maximize their chances of getting a work visa. I think at the end of the day, getting a work visa, it's there isn't really like anything you can do other than obviously getting a job, right? Because at the end of the day, if you have a job, it's up to the employer to actually file for your visa. And typically, most of the companies, especially for software engineering, they are pretty open to filing for visas for all the international students. I think again, things change depending on some of the political situation in the country. But for the most part, all my friends who've come here for education in software engineering, they have been able to get like jobs and get the visa, right? So I think you should focus more on finding a right job. So obviously, like to get a job, I think it's also helpful to have an internship. In fact, like many of like a couple of my friends have actually even had some work experience back in India and then did their masters, in which case it's much easier to find a job because companies already look at that you have experience and that counts. So that could be also one way to kind of like get more assured that you'll find a job to
Yeah,
maybe after an experience.
yeah, that's very insightful. I think that's helpful. So moving kind of away from that, and back to the comparison between startups and corporations, how do interviews for startups differ from those established in corporations?
I think it vary a lot. I would say, well, also I would say Google is a little bit more unique in that. In fact, like larger companies have different patterns as well. One thing which is very unique about Google is typically they interview candidates before they decide which team they will go into. In most of the places, typically they, depending on person's background, they will kind of like choose, okay, this person feels like better fit for back end, front end, or mobile, whatever that team is, and then they will interview. In Google specifically, they've like been historically had a format where they will say that we have the same bar across no matter which team you join, so that we can have people move across different teams. And because of that, they actually have a central process for interviewing. Even you cannot guess who your interview is going to be. It can be anybody from any team. And that's why the experience could be like totally dependent on the person, right? Like sometimes they will ask you system questions. Sometimes they ask you like very specific programming questions. They could be like particular on coding. They could be particular on design. And at the same time, like I think, uh, like there is a decision that's done by a hiring committee, and that hiring committee is again independent of all the candidates, all the interviewees. So sorry, all the interviewers. So essentially there's like set of people who interview you, and then there's like a team which is called hiring committee that reads the feedback and makes a decision. So it's kind of like very independent process, and the reason they've kept independent process is to avoid any kind of bias or any kind of like favors happening during the process. Now, coming to startups, I've done a lot of interviewing. By the way, one thing I did not mention is I've done a lot of interviews. So if you have any specific questions around like interview itself, I'm happy to answer that. I think like so far in my career, I've done over like 400 interviews. So, and this is across both engineering and product. So happy to answer questions on that. But again, in terms of startups, typically it's very specific that they're looking for like a particular role in a particular team, in which case the interview may be focused on that. Like for instance, in my current company, we were to hire some mobile developers, in which case we actually focused a lot of interview questions on mobile development. And likewise, when we were hiring somebody from systems background, we had like questions which were like focused on like system architectures. So it depends again from company to company, but I would say in terms of startups, like they typically go like everyone has like their different formats, and many times like people will ask like very different kind of questions. I remember like one of the companies like HomeJoy, when I was interviewing with them, they started a process of like inviting the candidate on, like, so they did 2 days. The first day was all the interview questions, And once you qualify for that, they'll invite you one day to sort of like do a project day, where they'll give you a project, sit with you, give you access to all, like you can like search whatever you want to, but they'll give you a particular task to complete. And that's an interesting way. And after that, we'll make a decision. So again, startups vary a lot because like they have to also figure out like how to get the right talent, how to work around that. And it could, yeah, like it could totally depend from company to company.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like I find that really fascinating. So I'm going to go ahead and move slightly similar. So it's still comparing different companies. So someone's asking, what are the differences in the corporate culture between Adobe and some of the other companies you've worked for?
Corporate culture between Adobe and other companies. It's funny because actually my wife currently works in Adobe, so I can go and ask her. But Adobe was actually a really fun company to work at. Like, again, I think it depends a lot on the project. And like one of the most important things is, especially in early in your career, is going to be your manager. Doing a lot of we were doing a lot of I would say like white hat hacking in a way, where we were like building a lot of flash player apps and like mobile apps with flash player, and kind of like experimenting a lot with the new devices. And all of that was, we were able to do it in a very startup mode, even though we were working in a very big company. So it totally depends. And I think just having the right manager actually makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's great, because I have heard every once in a while, everyone mentions that the manager is so important, which before Xoogler School was never something I thought about. So that's always interesting to hear. So going back a little bit to interviews, Elena is asking, what are some of the best practices for technical interviews and how do you make yourself stand out?
That's a great question. I think it varies a lot. So there are like some things which I've typically recommended almost everyone. One thing is people like anyone, like a candidate typically underestimates how different it is to actually write code during an interview versus the code you write in your daily life. Right? Typically, when you write code in your daily life, you're probably not using very complex or like tricky algorithms, right? Like for the most part, you're using a bunch of like for loops or while loops, or kind of like defining very standard maps. Versus when you're actually writing code in an interview, you're probably expected to use some smart algorithms. The other thing is typically during an interview setting, you don't get access to like searching on Stack Overflow, for instance, which is probably something you would do 10 times when you're writing your code in real life. So typically what I recommend students to do is practice a lot and practice without using sort of like a autocomplete type IDE. Like practice maybe writing it on a regular notepad, maybe writing it on like a piece of paper or like a whiteboard. And I think the difference is because that helps you just like memorize a lot of like some of the references, which otherwise you would like forget when you have to write the code without using like Stack Overflow. Many of the candidates, especially during like interviewers during these virtual times, would actually like let you search for certain references online. But I would recommend if you can actually like be, like already know all of those things on top of your head, it's generally better. And you also save time during interview. So I think that's something I would really recommend. The other thing is generally it's always be very like always be active listening and like be very careful about what the interviewer is saying, because many of the times if the interviewer is kind of like trying to guide you in a different directions, you would really want to follow along. Most of the times, well, I would say there could be like sometimes it could be trick question or like trick direction, but most of the times they're giving you directions for the answer. Many times you can actually, for the most part, like actually you can use a lot of hints from the body language to actually like figure out the direction that they're asking you to move in and find the answer. And I think this is one thing which is very well done by some really good students or candidates, and that actually stands out. So I would really recommend you to kind of like at least, go along. At the end of the day, interview is also a lot about like collaboration and understanding whether as a candidate you can work very well with the team. And collaboration means that you're able to understand the other person well. So just be very thoughtful and like just kind of like listen very carefully to the instructions that are given by the interviewer. So like, yeah, focus on that.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of picking back off of that question, you touched on it a little bit, but someone that's going into a technical interview, what would you say to prepare? Like obviously working on memorizing and stuff like that, but then like what else should you be looking for and preparing?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, one thing is certainly whatever you write in your resume, make sure you can back that, right? Like maybe if there's like a project that you have described in it, make sure you know well about that project that you've worked in. If there is a programming language that you've listed in your resume, make sure you actually like know that well, even if you haven't worked in it in some time, at least like maybe practice it a little bit. Most of the interviewers will give you an option to choose your programming language to write code in, but there could be like some picky ones who would be like, no, actually you need to write a language in that code. In fact, I remember I interviewed at one company, I forgot which company was it. It was a startup, and I had like written Java in my resume, and I hadn't written code in Java in like 3 4 years, and they asked me to write code and I completely bombed it. And that can happen with everyone, right? Like you write code in a particular language, and if you don't like use that for a while, you may forget it, and that's totally fine. I think what you want to do is just kind of like be able to express that. In some cases the interviewers could be very picky, but for the most part, like they'll let you use whichever programming language you want. But at the same time, you should at least know certain constructs in the language that you have written in your resume. So focus on that. And in terms of algorithms, typically I recommend everyone like at least have a good understanding of like using standard things like maps, like kind of like any kind of implementation of maps or dictionaries, how to kind of like do recursion. That's also typically very important in interviews, because like many of the questions can be solved with recursion. And then I would say the third thing is maybe trees, because a lot of questions do ask implementation of trees. So kind of like focus on that too. So there are like only a few things which are very commonly asked. In fact, like I know the thing that scares me the most are dynamic programming questions. In fact, like I actually fail in most of the dynamic programming questions, and I see a lot of nods here. And I know like those are really annoying. In fact, like at least I've only been asked like maybe a couple of times the dynamic programming questions across like maybe 40, 50 interviews I've done in my life. So it's very rare, but it could happen. And like it's many times it's like maybe you just need hints from the interviewer in that case.
Yeah, definitely. So I find that very interesting. So kind of piggybacking off of that again. There's a question here that's kind of like, how much should you memorize when you're in a technical interview? Are they looking for very specifics, or are they looking for more of a general idea that you know how it works without like that specific syntax or vocabulary?
Sorry, so the question is if you don't know, or like how much you should memorize before you even go in an interview.
Yeah, so it's more of like, how much memorization do you think is appropriate for technical questions,
Yeah,
especially
I would
thinking
say,
about
yeah, I mean,
vocabulary and detailed syntax?
I think like it's more about practice. I don't think they would expect you to like know like all the libraries for reference. As I said, like a few things around like maybe you should at least know how to like kind of like store data in a map, like iterate in a map, or kind of like how you do recursion, how you kind of like define the loops, for loops and while loops, those kind of things. Because like if you can't even do that and that was your preferred language, that kind of looks weird, right? Like if you cannot even do basic constructs in a programming language that you prefer, that essentially means you're not been writing code regularly. So that kind of like appears at least that way, right? So I would say you should not need to know these things in every programming language that you know, but like at least there should be one programming language that you really know well. And these are some of the things that you should be able to do without having to look up references.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's definitely helpful because I know some people wonder where that line is. So I'm going to go ahead and move away slightly from interviewing and back onto the Google side. So Iris is asking, what are some things you did to make yourself discoverable by Google, and how did you resolve the visa issue when you were switching startups? And in her follow-up is, do you think starting one's career at Google has any drawbacks?
Okay, there's a lot of questions. So the first question was, how did I stand out for a Google recruiter?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think part of it was also like the kind of school I went to, which made me definitely kind of like stand out. At least like they looked at my resume. In fact, I remember actually, although it's weird because Google, like another story I did not tell was like even before I graduated, Google came to our campus, and my resume wasn't good enough for them. So they actually like never even interviewed me. I submitted my resume and they were like, no, we don't want you. And it's funny because what happens typically is landing first job is a bit tricky. I would say that, right? I think landing first job, no, like somebody's like making a bet on you because they don't really know, you don't have any experience, you don't um, like you don't have a lot to show. But I think like later, like as you grow in your career, you actually like build a lot of reputation. And so it matters a lot, kind of like what kind of work you do, where you work at. So even if you don't get like if you're not able to stand out right out of school, I think like having strong internships, projects, and those kind of things do build up over time. I think the other thing which probably stood out to Google was like, for instance, like those side project games that I built, and then like even at Adobe, like the kind of work I mobile development work I did, I think those kind of things did stand out to Google, and like those are things which actually like happen later, a little bit later, right? So I would say like don't freak out early enough that you're not able to stand out. It's more about like just like try to find the right opportunity or like the best opportunity you can in your time.
Yeah, so great. So off of that, so I know you touched a little bit on like starting a career, but so her second follow-up question was, do you think starting one's career at Google has any drawbacks? So
Has any drawbacks? Uh, I can't think of any, honestly. I mean, like, I think at the end of the day, all the decisions that you make in your life are less about like uh, what I mean. Like, it's at the end of the day, it's all about opportunity cost, right? Like, the question is, can you be doing something else which will be better with your time instead of like working at a company like Google, right? So you could argue possibly that maybe working at a startup could be a better opportunity, right? Where you can learn a lot. Maybe that's right, and I think like it could be interesting actually, like you actually especially like when you work in Google versus a startup. In startup you're working really hard because you're working maybe like 10-12 hours many times depending on how early stage startup you're working at, and you learn a lot. So so I would say like at some point I would like still recommend people to like go and like work at both early stage and late stage companies. You can possibly like start with a startup and then go to work at big companies, and that's totally fine too. I think it's a matter of like just getting exposure at both places. It's all about like opportunity cost. In fact, like one of the things I typically say is you should not really like get too comfortable at a place, right? Like especially when you're early in your career, you would want to learn a lot, experiment a lot, and try out a different things, right? So in a way you would want to like as I said, like work at early stage company, work at large stage companies, and like this kind of like exposure gives you like understanding of what really, where exactly do you really excel, and eventually like later in your career you should be able to like uh, go into places where you stay for a longer period of time, right? Because then you have already like learned and experimented with a lot of different things. So yeah, I mean, you can technically start a company, like work at your own company, and like start your own company and kind of like uh, yeah, and like grow from there, right? Like I think early in your career, especially, you don't have a lot of like risk. Like I mean, you have a big risk appetite. You don't have like any big liabilities or like kind of like paying your mortgages or like paying having to like take care of your kids. So like certainly you can do that too, but at the same time, like working in like large companies certainly give you a lot different perspective as well, which is worthwhile.
yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that helped answer that question. So I'm going to kind of move away here to another question that we have. It's, what resources did you use to learn about investing / startups when you first learning?
I think I also probably did like pretty much learning on the job in a way, right? So I said I pretty much did not know much about startups before I joined Homejoy, which was my first startup job. And most of the things that I learned about a startup was actually from that company. So it's funny because like that was a company that grew really, really fast, and I learned so much from there. I mean, obviously, like it had its own shortcomings, right? Like at some point, it got sold to Google, and like obviously, part of the reason it also got sold to Google was like it was not able to grow further or like do bigger fundraise. So So many times you actually like learn from both successes as well as failures. And like I think both success and failures to a certain degree teaches you a lot about startups and investments. I would say like kind of like just being very close to a lot of startups, and especially working with the Xoogler network, we do get to interact with a lot of different startups and gives you a lot of different exposure.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's really great advice learned about since you learned on the job. Not some people have different opinions about that, so I would really enjoy hearing about that. So we have another question here that was back to the Google and when you got offered the role. So the exact question is, you mentioned earlier how you were offered a role you didn't want but accepted it. Later, you were able to negotiate for a better role. Can you describe how this process was like?
Okay, I'll try my best. So what happened was I mean, I was a software engineer in Adobe, and I was reached out to by Google. They offered me to interview for a role in US, and the role was software engineering and test. And I wasn't really like very excited about like working in software engineering and test, although I think like the way they do software engineering and test is essentially it's a team that builds a lot of like test infrastructure. So it could still have been interesting, but I was like particularly not excited about working on that. Um, so I had like this conversation. I was like I expressed it initially, like it doesn't sound like very appealing, but like if you think it's still like worth my time, I'm happy to kind of like talk about it. And we talked about it, and I think like I got at least like, okay, it's like maybe something I still need to like learn more about and pursue. And what ended up happening was I did talk to like the interviewers I had were also from similar backgrounds. So it gave me a little bit more perspective, and I kind of like went with a open mind in terms of like trying to figure out what this role is going to be and like learning more about it. So after I interviewed, I ended up like getting an offer, and at that point I started evaluating my current role where I was working in Adobe, and we still had this project, and we were like still excited like working on this startup mode, versus like kind of like going to a like US and like it's across the globe in a way, right? And like moving away, and at some point I had to um, I told them that like this sounds like a little bit too. This is not like ideal for me, and in some ways I don't see I'm really excited about like this particular role. What ended up happening was I actually ended up like declining that offer altogether. So it wasn't really like I pushed a lot for them to kind of like give me this role. I mean, I kind of like told them like if you give me a software engineer role, then I'll accept. But this is like not the right start for me in a different company. So in fact, like when I declined the offer, I did not hear back from them in a couple of months. And I was actually like probably like I was comfortable with that, like because like the company I was working in Adobe and like team, I was really like enjoying there. So I think at some point you need to make decisions where you need to compare like what you have today versus what you're getting in the offer, right? And it's not always like compensation. Obviously, like if you think about compensation, what I was getting paid in India would be much lower than what I would be getting paid at Google. But it was more about like kind of work I'd be doing.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. Like the different areas that you think of it. It's not necessarily just pay. There's a lot of other values that go into this.
Yeah. In fact, actually, like I'll kind of do one more note that historically, I think I have always taken jobs with the lowest offer. Like even when I said like I had offer from Microsoft, Adobe, and Amazon, Adobe was the lowest offer among all three. And the reason I actually chose Adobe was the work they were doing was really amazing. Like in Microsoft, they were putting me in a team which would be working on Windows. And I was like, this doesn't sound very exciting. Versus in Adobe, they were like putting me in a team which would be working on mobile devices and like literally like hacking mobile devices to put on Flash Player onto it. So I was like, this sounds pretty cool. And like, that's why I ended up joining that. And in fact, yeah, even when like HomeJoy was getting acquired by Google, like I had like a pretty good offer from Google to go back there and enjoy working there, but I decided to actually like not do that and go do my own startup. So always like kind of it's always important like you think about the work you'll be doing and like the people you'll be working with and not just the compensation you'll be getting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really like hearing about that. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead. Elena has a question here that you touched on briefly, but asked to go into more detail. So you said that Google makes you a great engineer, but how does it make you a great engineer? What technical/soft skills make you a great Google engineer?
Technical and soft skills. Okay, so I mean, that's a great question. So I think in terms of my experience, as I said, like when I joined Google, my first code review itself like took like 2 weeks to get reviewed and merged. So at that point itself, like it kind of like gives you like you learn so much in terms of like technical skills itself, as in like not just writing code that works, but writing code that is maintainable and easy to understand and follow is very important. And especially like kind of like learning from looking at other people's code, it's more about like just learning a lot from your peers. And that's what makes Google very different, in which Google always has like a very high bar to get into, and every engineer that gets into Google is like really smart. And that itself, like the byproduct of that itself is kind of like you focus a lot on like good code quality standards. Now that said, like it's not like all like startups don't have high quality bar. I think the difference in startups is like you are supposed to move really fast, which essentially means you cannot spend like 2 weeks doing code review for 1,000 line of code. Like if you do that, like you probably never ship the product. So that's why priorities are very different in startups, and that's why like it's easy to get to neglect like code quality, and that's why it's a little bit different in that sense. I think the second aspect was around communication. I think companies like Google, like they typically like, I mean, it's also true for a lot of like also large scale companies, but one of the things is like things move a little bit slower there. And the reason they move slow is because you have to kind of like typically interact with a lot of different teams and make really like a decision that really like every team agrees on. And this in itself kind of like goes back to kind of like you really need to um, like find out all the reasons why your decision or why your whatever like you're proposing to all the entire teams, it actually is like technically sound and like it makes sense. And this kind of like boils down to like having the right ways to communicate and doing the proper research. So these are kind of things which are done very well in bigger companies, and like they're enforced a lot more because like you have the time and the liberty to do it, versus in early stage companies it's more about like many times you don't have enough data to actually make the decisions, right? Many times you're just making decisions very quickly and very like and with like only partial data, which is also a skill in itself, right? Like being able to make smart decisions with very limited data. That's how kind of like most of the startups work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I feel like it's logical, but it's not like often addressed as like how that works, but it does make sense. So I'm going to go ahead, and Iris is asking another question. We're shifting slightly from Google engineering to like the mobile developer side. So she's asking, what are the biggest challenges you face as a mobile developer, and her second question then is, what development platform do you recommend?
Challenges that I face as a mobile developer. I mean, I think one of the things is well, it's both advantages and disadvantages, like right. One of the advantages of being a mobile developer is like you're very close to the product, and kind of like in a way you're driving users experience. The disadvantage is many of the times like a lot of like interesting things actually happen on the back end, and mobile is more about like building the interfaces, right? So it's kind of like a balance between the two. So I think it has both advantages and disadvantages that way. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was she's asking like what platform you prefer to use.
So I've done mobile development in many different platforms. Like most of it was native. So it was like back in the days, it used to be just Objective-C. Now it's like Swift as well. And I've done a lot of like some of the development in Swift as well. I have done some work in React Native as well. I would though recommend, like, I think most part, like if you're building complex applications, you probably want to just stay with native apps. And the reason is like many times like doing complex things, or especially like animations and graphics, can get really tricky if you're using React Native. React Native is really good if you're like working on a startup idea, which you really want to like test out very quickly and like on all platforms. So it helps you build like both iOS and Android quickly.
Sorry, just to clarify, I meant like development platform. So like Xcode or like Visual Studio or things like that?
I mean, then it totally depends, right? So for iOS, you don't really have a lot of options. You have to use Xcode, especially if you're doing native app development. I think if you're using React Native, you can use a lot of different ones.
Okay.
For Android, like typically I've used IntelliJ, which actually provides support for both Java as well as Kotlin. That are the two preferred languages for Android. And IntelliJ also has like a community edition, which is actually free. So you can use that. And in fact, like there's no difference between a business edition and a community edition. They just like expect people to pay for businesses directly. Like like just have like two different versions of that. I think we are coming close to a time. I don't know, like I was actually surprised there were so many questions. When Chris proposed me do this talk, I was like, we should probably just do 30 minutes. People will not have enough questions.
So we'll do another one next week for 90 minutes, right, Ankit?
Sure. Instead, like I'm happy to kind of like take questions offline as well, answer on Slack, or if like somebody has questions, like more specific particular questions. I've done office hours before, but if there's more interest, I can do more. Jennifer, do you have like more questions that you would want to go through in the list?
Yeah, so I think if you're okay with it, I had just one more question here for priority. And it's just asking like, what are traits that you should look for in a manager when you're first starting out in your career? So both what are bad traits and what are good traits?
I think this is very hard, especially when you're looking during an interview time, like getting a perspective of a person is very hard versus what it is actually during work. I think during work, it's a little bit easier. For instance, early when you join a team, like you can kind of like easily see firstly how your onboarding process is, how much like your manager is getting involved into that, like how many check-ins that manager is doing. The other thing is you would want to like at least have managers who are like helping you in your career, like as in like having conversations about your career. It's not like at the end of the day, every job is a stepping stone, right?